first session is the Keynote. The topic for the Keynote is Educational Leadership for Digital Age, Vision for 21st Century School. For delivering the Keynote, I would like to call on stage Mr. Anuraag Saxena, Asia Head for the World Education Foundation. Mr. Anuraag is the Asia Head for the World Education Foundation UK and leads the Asia Partnerships and Entry Strategy. In this capacity, he enables schools and educational institutions in the K-12 segment with tools and strategy to measure and improve learning outcomes, creating trust tools for schools to interact with extended set of stakeholders, such as parents, regulators, Board of Education, etc., and building relationships with grant makers and multilateral agency in the education space.
A very good morning to you all. Very happy and honored to be speaking to all of you. The typical job of a keynote speaker is to essentially wake up the audience from their slumber and wait around till the rest of the audience trickles in. I'm very glad that I don't have to do either. Thank you so much. So this is, just making sure you guys know who I am, right? So I'm really quite glad I don't have to do either. True to schools that you all represent, everybody was in at 9 when the bell rang. True to the schools you guys represent, the back benches got filled in before the front benches did. So thank you guys. Can we have the presentation up, please? Presentation. So I'm here to speak today about leading in the digital age. If you all are expecting pearls of wisdom around digital technology and MOOCs and all of that, then I must disappoint you up front. What I'm here to speak about and set the tone for later in the day is two of the phases that you see here. We'll talk about what leadership means in the context of schools and digital technology. And I'm more interested in what the whole concept of digital age means. What is the digital age? And why should we worry about the digital age? Just in terms of how we spend the day, I'm just going to introduce myself and the organization in a minute or two. Like I said, we'll talk about what it means to be in the digital age in the context of school leaders. We'll talk a little bit about the concept of leading itself, right? And then get to the core theme of what business you are in. I mean, let's face it, despite what the government has to say, bread needs to be buttered and an organization needs to be run. And then hopefully leave some time for Q&A at the end. But if anyone has any glaring thoughts, then feel free to stop me in the middle. I'd like the first session to be interactive, interesting. Believe you me when I say this, that each of you in this room has much more to contribute to this topic than I do. The one person that will give a testament to that is my lovely wife over there. Sandhya is her name, and if you're wondering, ki yaar Anurag ne to jackpot hit kar liya, yes, it is true. And my two children, Zana and Kaiser, and I'll show you why they'll be relevant in a little bit. Quickly about the organization itself. For those of you who haven't heard, we are a UK-based foundation with operations in many countries. I head up the Southeast Asia office. I'm based in Singapore, and I cover everything essentially starting from India down to Australia. WEF does a couple of things. WEF does education policy, WEF does school assessments. WEF essentially is here to elevate the quality of K-12 education. What's relevant to this audience is where we talk about school quality and how that needs to be communicated. Now, I'm sure some of you are wondering that here is an organization that is headquartered in the UK. Here is Anuraag that is based in Singapore. Why is Anuraag here, or why is WEF here? I'm sure some of you have, or all of you have seen this slide at some point in your lives. It went viral about a year back. It's very interesting for us to note that half the world's population actually lives inside that little circle. it's very interesting to note that Singapore sits bang in the middle of that circle. Now, the first time I saw that graph, I was kind of amazed, right? So here you have less than 1/4 of the world's landmass, and half the population lives there. And what does it mean in terms of implication to governments and to individuals that are running any kind of organization, not just in education? Let me just show it to you in terms of an example. Can all of you from behind see what this is? Plastic ball. Color? Pink. Perfect. Now this is the test for your mathematics skills as well as your guessing skills, right? Now, here is a ball. Imagine this is equivalent to 25,000 schools. So here's a little world that has 25,000 schools in it. Now is where the questions start. I don't know if all of you can see the graph below, or the text below. It has the names of countries in there. Can you guys hear me behind? Without the mic?
Yes.
Super. So this is 25,000 schools. So now we're going to talk in terms of the number of balls. How many schools do you think all of Great Britain has? Or how many balls would all of Great Britain have? Any guesses are as good as the other. 220. 220. Huh? That's the answer for you. Right? So there's exactly 24,700 schools in all of Great Britain put together. Whichever was the next country. Germany. How about Germany? Okay. Close guess. Closest, given that it was the only guess. Right? So twice the number. How about the US? So यहाँ तो बोली लग रही है. Twice, thrice.
5 times 10.
5 times the number. 10 times the number.
10 balls.
10 balls. Okay. 10 going once, 10 going twice. The US has 5. Right? So just think of where we are essentially replicating education technologies and education curriculum and education practices from. Right? So there's 1 ball in the UK, 2 in Germany, 5 in the US. Now let's get to Nepal. How many do you think Nepal has? Half. Slightly more than 1. As my daughter would say, pink takes precedence over any other color. So Nepal has 34,000 schools, while the UK has 24. Right? Bangladesh?
It's only 1 ball.
4. Indonesia?
3.
10. Guys, backbenchers need to speak up.
5.
5 and
3.
3.
Maybe 7.
Indonesia has 10. India?
25.
So basically here is how the world is divided into. That's the Western world, where most of the so-called innovation, curriculum development, blah 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 happens. This is our part of the world. What all these schools have decided now is that, hey, guess what? We'll just do what these guys are doing. Right? And we'll just advocate. Which is where the core of the problem is. Now, keep your eyes on the balls there and extrapolate it to another figure I'd like to superimpose. That's the amount of money the government spends on every school student a year. In the UK, I'm sorry you can't see it too well, so I'll read it out for you. In the UK, it's just over $10,000. In Germany, it's about $7,500. In the USA, it's 10,000 something. Right? So those three sets of little fish bowls you see there, you're spending roughly $8,000 to $10,000 per student per year. Now let's get to Nepal, Bangladesh, Indonesia, and India. I tried making a graph using stacks of money, but then the graph was so short you could not have seen it. So I've replaced it with coins instead. So Nepal is $77. Compare that to $10,000 elsewhere. Bangladesh is 57. Indonesia is 423, surprisingly. And India is 77. Right? So what's really happening here, right? We have a crazy number of schools in this part of the world. Now, fair, the schools in their structure are very different, in their objectives are very different. Most of you here might not even find this relevant because all of you lead the cool schools, which don't have to face the problem the rest of India does. But then at the same time, we as a nation are going ahead and saying, hey, let's, I don't know, what is 10,000 divided by 77? Mr. Mathematics here, Harish. Come on, we are all educators. Somebody has to. Sorry? Okay, so less than 1% or whatever, right? 0.66, yeah. And we're saying that, let's see how close we can get to a British model or an American model, and that's not going to happen, right? I've just extrapolated the same number over a graph, which again you cannot see because it's in mild gray, but imagine the world map behind. The same representation here done in terms of, the size of each market. Overlaid are these rectangular tags on agencies that you have that provide transparency, that set standards, that set protocols for the K-12 industry in that respective country. So here you have a very unique situation, right? All these schools that you see here have an NCME or an Ofsted or whatever else with set standards and protocols. All these schools here really have none, and which is basically what us interested. Presentation, please. Which is basically what got us interested in being in India, or rather this part of the world. Now to top it, again, I'm so sorry, but there was a grayscale US map below it. What you see is the school district map of New York, which is magnified. North to south is about 70 kilometers, no, 54 kilometers. East to west is about 45 kilometers, which is roughly the size of Delhi NCR. Now, if you look at each of those small little school districts in there, I'm sure all of you are aware, in the US or the UK or whatever, people have, or kids have to be in the geographical vicinity of the school to go there, which basically means their parents are likely to be more or less equally educated from the same socioeconomic strata, etc., etc., etc. So there is a more or less a consistent level of schools within a particular area. In fact, rentals are pretty much divided, defined by where good or great schools are. Now, if you compare that to the Indian model, all of you guys face a huge diversity challenge, right? While in the US, let's say if you were in Queens, chances are very, presentation up please? Yeah. If you were in Queens, chances are very high that you would have an African American or a Hispanic child whose parents are daily wage laborers, and all of them face the similar challenges at home and then a different set at school, but then there isn't too much of uniqueness or diversity among that, right? In each of your schools, and I can say this without conviction, you have a parent that works for an IT company or a consulting firm or a bank who's traveled the world and has a set of expectations. You have a family business owner who basically needs his kid to go through school so he can go sit in the shop or the factory at some point, whose expectations are very different again. we are in Delhi, so you obviously have the politician or somebody who thinks he is or she is, who sends his kids to the same school because of RT, and it's not whether RT is right or wrong, whether we support it or not, that's besides the point. But the fact is, schools are increasingly seeing children that don't, quote unquote, fit in with their other classmates. The know-it-all intellectual looks Bengali, but that's only a coincidence. So you have the intellectual think tank types, who have another set of really, really crazy expectations from schools. And then finally, what you see in a very huge scale in the last 10, 15 years in India is the first generation urban parent who's moved in from a village or a small town, and is still trying to grapple with and not able to support their child as much as a second, third generation urban parent does. And each of you as a school principal, school trustee, school chairman, even teachers every day are having to deal with at least these 6 sets of parents who are each very, very different from the other. Right? So we've talked about how scales are very different in India, the sizes of individual schools or the education ecosystem itself. We've talked about the complexity and diversity, and clearly I don't need to talk to you about budgets. We had the other graph there. Right. So therefore we said, hey, listen, this is a very exciting space for us to be in. So let's go in and try and support the Ministry of HRD and schools, and see how we can either bring in best practices or how we can apply learnings from one country within this region to the other, or from schools within one physical space to the other. So at a very high level, the 2 or 3 things that WEF does, we do transparency through school ratings, so it's kind of like a CRISIL for schools, if you might, which to me was sort of very, very intuitive, right? If this hotel can be star rated, and if a bond in a bank can be rated, and so on and so forth, why should not a school be? Given the level of engagement and importance that it has in a parent's and a child's life, right? We do advisory on the policy side specifically, and we do capability building, which is building bridges between the organizations we work with globally and organizations that we associate with within each region or country. I won't spend too much time on it. So of the people that sort of guide, advise, and sit on our board and all of that are pretty much people that represent, from Stanford to University of London to, to the former director and dean of IIM Ahmedabad to, people from but essentially the idea is, we wanted to make sure that there's a broad set of academic and non-academic inputs which we are able to channel and use ourselves as a conduit into our practices in this part of the world. Like I said, there's a whole cross-section of organizations that we work with globally. Quickly moving in. So let's get to the core of the topic today, right? So what is the digital age? As you would have figured by now, I'm not a very intelligent or a cerebral guy or a complex guy, right? So to me, it's very, very simple. And I use it as an example. So second quiz for you. How many of you remember my daughter's name? Zana, okay. So this was going to be almost shameful, but thank you so much. So Zana, she just turned 6 years old. As you can see in the background is Mount Sinabung. I don't know if you guys remember, but about a year or a year and a half back, it had just blown up. And we being the ever-loving parents, we said, ki chalo bachcho ko leke chalte hain. So it was a fairly interesting experience where everybody else was trying to get out of the airport and we were the only ones flying in. But something really interesting happened there. So Zana was asking me a bunch of questions around how tall is the mountain, and I told her, and then she says, what comes out of a mountain? Lava. What is lava made up of? Metals. But what kind of metals? I don't know. How hot is lava? So I'm like, I have no idea, but it should be about 2,000-3,000 degrees. How long is it going to spew? No idea. So, so at the end of it, she says, Papa, listen, you don't worry. Let's get back to the hotel and you ask Google, let's get back to the hotel and you can ask Google. Google anyway knows much more than you do. Which was kind of an aha moment for me, because it meant that me as a parent, right, when I was growing up, which was clearly not too long back, when I was growing up, parents and teachers held that position in our own eyes, that any question you had, you would get an answer from them. And that answer, whether it was right or not, you assumed it to be right, right? And that's all the access that you had. And that now is changing drastically, right? Kids are so much more curious, right? And I'm not saying this as any doting parent does. There is so much of research which is coming out of Western Europe, which actually quantifies the curiosity levels over generations. There's been a steep spike since 2002, which is closely related to how much of digital technology is available, right? Kids are significantly more argumentative. The argumentativeness, if that is a word, I don't know. The more prosperity a human being sees, the more likely he is to engage in an argument with you. There's research from Stanford that says that's going to be the biggest social challenge that families will face, because there's more money, more prosperity, leading to more self-confidence, which then leads to leads to more discussions, arguments, fights, which might not have happened in the past. Like I said, unfortunately, there is a reduced dependence on schools and on teachers. Google and apps and what have you. And at the end of the day, small attention spans. I don't know if you guys have read your children's or students' WhatsApp messages and all of that. I just don't understand what the heck they're trying to say. So the problem you have today is with technology, and specifically with education technology, everything from our generation is pretty much replaceable. You can replace a teacher with a YouTube or a Khan Academy session. You can replace books with a whole bunch of other alternatives. Buildings and facilities, while very important, while being USPs, are kind of going redundant, right? Worse fears are coming true. So what do we do as school leaders? What do we do as school leaders? I'm going to ignore and speed up these two slides on how EdTech is catching up, but I'm sure you'll find these numbers, and the numbers are really very staggering, especially the next slide. What you don't see is this is a scale from 1995 to 2014. The spike you see is around 2009, 2010, right? And the amount of interest the amount of paper-based teaching that has been replaced with digital teaching is just going crazy, and there's no saying where that would go. So the question is, if there's Anuraag on stage saying teachers are replaceable and students are books are replaceable and all of that, what do we as leaders then need to do to make sure that we kind of insulate ourselves from that change? What most school trustees and principals do on a day-to-day basis are a bunch of things you see here. There's hiring, there's retention, there's communication, there's planning, payroll, a whole bunch of administrative tasks. In my specific view, all of this is management. This is not leading. If you're able to hire a teacher faster than the next school, great. But that doesn't make you a leader, right? If you're able to, get a better deal from an infrastructure vendor, makes you a great manager, doesn't make you a great leader. What is it that makes you a great leader, right? I will submit very humbly that it's all about future-proofing, and Utkarsh mentioned that as part of his opening remarks as well. How do we make sure that we future-proof our schools from these coming changes and tsunamis? In my view, the next generation, and I would shudder to think beyond that, is going to be about three things. Being frugal, and these are what I believe our kids are going to learn. being frugal, being multicultural, and what I call being Brownian, in terms of Brownian motion, if there are any physics teachers here. What do I mean by being frugal? Sorry, is there anyone here that doesn't understand Hindi? Does not understand Hindi? Okay, good. So I'm going to use an example. This is interestingly something my father talks about all the time. When we were children, lower middle class, living in a small town, हमारे घर सब्जी जो है वो टोकरी में आती थी. हमारे घर में एक आंगन था, केले का पेड़ था, right? Today, purely in monetary terms, our family, or I am probably much more, and I'm sure each of us in this room are much more prosperous than our parents were. But सब्जी टोकरी में नहीं आती, छोटे से थैले में आती है. जो आंगन होता था वो अभी 4 फुट की बालकनी हो गई है, right? Sure, there are air conditioners in the house. Sure, there are wonderful cars. Sure, we watch movies in a much better, in a PVR or whatever kind of setting. But the fact is, we are having to live with less than our parents did. And the fact is that our kids will have to live with less than we did. Are we teaching our kids to live with less, right? And that's something that genuinely worries me. Being multicultural as an example, and I see it even more, compounded because I live in Singapore. Back when we were kids, and maybe I just grew up in a weird place, there was that one Tamil girl that everybody kind of looked at, made fun of, and blah, blah, blah in school, right? She wore different clothes, different practices. And it was very, very common to say, अच्छा, ये तो यहाँ से है, so ये festival मनाता है, वो वहाँ से है, तो ऐसा खाना खाता है, अच्छा, ये तो so and so जगह से है, इसके parents तो 5 बजे उठ के पूजा करते हैं, ha ha ha. It was much later in life where multiculturality was kind of forced upon us, and we all adapted and did well. Our kids, on the other hand, especially urban kids, are growing up in a very multicultural environment, which only gets complicated if they were to go abroad for education or whatever else. Are we preparing kids to accept multiculturality very, very openly? And finally, like I said, I mean, this is my big thing. For those of you who come from a physics background, that's a visual representation of the Brownian motion. For those of you who don't come from a physics background, please go back and talk to your physics teachers. But essentially, careers are not linear anymore, even if you like them, right? Whether you like it or not, a human being will shift jobs 8 times in their lifetime. They will shift careers thrice in their lifetime, right? And from a corporate perspective, that is something that corporates are having to deal with, human beings are having to deal with. So the question I ask you is, can you think you can survive without reinvention? And what do you need to do to then reinvent yourself, right? So I go back to a fundamental question that I ask everybody. Hey, what business are you in really, right? Are you in the business of teaching? No, because Google takes over. Are you in the business of disciplining your kids? No, there are better ways to do it. Are you in the business of better infrastructure? No, because somebody else will, so you have a swimming pool, somebody else will build a temperature-controlled pool. You have an air-conditioned bus, somebody else will have a Mercedes-Benz air-conditioned bus. Now, I'm going to skip through the rest quickly because I'm being warned about my timing, but my brief, very simply, there's this really nice Coca-Cola study, if you guys could go back to. Coca-Cola in 1984-85 was faced with a dwindling share of the market, right? Lowered profit margins, etc., etc. Roberto Goizueta, who was their CEO, at some point went ahead and said, hey, listen, let's just get together and redefine what the heck we are doing here. After a lot of research and brainstorming, they came up with a simple answer. They said, hey, you know what? We're not in the Coca-Cola market. We're not in the cold drinks market. We're in the share of stomach market. We need to own more of a human being's stomach. And from the 60s and 70s, where basically you sold Coca-Cola in different kinds of packaging and sizes, they now look like that. So whether it's water, whether it's juice, whether it's chips, whatever it is, they're essentially saying, hey, we need to own more of what you consume, right? Similarly, I think schools today need to go through that rethink and say, hey, what are we about? Are we about education? Are we about curriculum? Are we about the best teachers? Are we about the best infrastructure? My take is you're basically in the business of trust. Plain and simple, that's about it. Nobody trusts schools, or nobody trusts anybody else more than they trust schools, right? That is what differentiates you. That is what keeps students with you. That's how you extract value, right? What is the difference between a 10 crore ka infrastructure and a school that's valued at 40 crores, right? You could call it goodwill, you could call it what have you, right? And unfortunately, the challenge that I see is if you look at a cross-section of stakeholders, whether it's parents, boards, multilateral agencies, banks, what have you, schools have not figured out a way to start with, understand the value of the trust people place in it, right? I would love to see a day where school says, hey, you know what? Goodwill or trust or whatever it is, and I'm not talking about goodwill as an accounting term, I'm talking about it as a very live, living concept. Goodwill is half of what we are today, or goodwill is 80% of what we have, or trust. हमारे स्कूल से ट्रस्ट निकल गया, like what happened with the school which had a couple of cases of, you know, molestation charges and all of that, one of the largest chains here, right? How much of value, there is a financial value to what got eroded from that school. I don't know what it is, but I hope the school is going through that thought process and say, you know what, we didn't set mechanisms to stop, you know, child abuse, because of which our value is lesser by so and so, right? I'd like school to understand and say that, you know, here is a mechanism for us to actually measure what that trust means and what the value of it is, and actually communicate it to stakeholders. When the Leela says we are a 5-star school or a 6-star school, there's a very simple way of communicating that value. But then you understand what that value means. I mean, you go to Turkey or, I don't know, Sydney or wherever else. You go on TripAdvisor and figure out how good or bad a hotel is, right? And schools need to start doing something very, very similar. And then actually have a very structured plan of what you were to do if you were to get bonus trust, and what you would do if you were to suddenly lose that trust. And I don't see a lot of school leaders planning for that, right? What we are doing right now is we are picking 100 schools across Southeast Asia, 100 schools across South Asia, that's India, Bangladesh, Bhutan, and Nepal. And we are going to take them through a rating, take them through an assessment and certify them and, you know, star rate them like schools are, etc., which will also help us understand how schools operates, what are important to them, what are the levers that different school leaders are working on, etc., etc. We hope that some of you would be keen, or we hope that, you know, we can get to learn a lot from you guys. And we really, really hope that over time, this industry gets as evolved as a lot of other industries. And the reason I say this to conclude is really very simple, right?
Is your rating different from ISO?
Yeah, it is very different from ISO. In 2 or 3 ways. ISO is a generic rating, right, which an automotive company, a hotel, a school, or whatever could go through. Yeah, it's about processes. We are very specifically focused on the K-12 segment and education, so that's one. Second is, you know, without any qualitative judgment on anybody, ISO kind of requires or encourages you to bring in a consultant who you pay money to, who also assesses you. You know, so a lot of people would think of it as a conflict of interest, right? If you were to pay me money to advise you on how to get a good rating, and then I am supposed to come and assess you, then there's a challenge there, right? So A, the fact that it is very education specific. B, the fact that there are no middlemen, agents, consultants, or touts involved. And C, you know, the fact that it doesn't cost much because it's subsidized by the UK, right? So
CBSE started accreditation of schools, and they had the CSQ manual and all these things there, which includes leadership, academics, my school and management, everything there. So, are you different from that?
oh yes, we're very different from that.
Could we get some literature about you, see what you are doing there?
Sure, of course, I'll be happy to. I mean, I'll pick up your card and send it out to you.
Some kind of website where we could look at all these things there.
Yeah, so the website is there, but yeah, I will pass you my card. So yeah, feel free to have a look, and I'm very happy to debate CBSE versus ISO versus us. So,
That CBSE thing has not really taken off for various reasons.
It is. And if you see that booklet Dr. Parashar has made, if we can at least comply and discipline ourselves to that, even Goddess Saraswati would have a problem.
Yes.
That perfect booklet. And she would ask questions, what kind of school are you running? Because I've seen that in detail, I've been involved in some way. But I have one question for you, sir. That point of standardized testing, you have pointed that.
yes.
Every place, every student, even within India, within places, we have very different contexts and socio-cultural norms in which they come up. I'm very uncomfortable with the concept of standardized testing, especially in schools. Many a time you talked about ratings like a hotel and stuff like that. How does it come right in a scholastic spectrum where a student in Kanyakumari or a student in Ladakh come through very different filters, cultures, and to the extent a student in Ladakh does not have a teacher, does not know 44 plus 33, 77 at class 7, while a Delhi student gets much more. So how does your assessment system cater for that?
Okay, so I think that's a beautiful question, and I will break that down into two responses. A, what we conduct is a school assessment, not a student assessment. And that's purely, so I'm just kind of dipping into the statistical concept of assessments a little bit. That's purely because some of you are given a worse hand, you're dealt a worse hand, and that is not your fault, right? So we try and assess a school's quality independent of input factors. If I run a 60-year-old reputed school, you run a new school which is equally great, but I have, you know, I'm able to attract a higher IQ, let's just say IQ is a good measure, although, you know, I hate it myself. But I'm just saying for the sake of argument, right? If I'm getting a higher grade of students in, I will get a higher grade of students out. So we don't assess students, we assess a school independent of the student, which is weird in itself. Second, I will extend your Kanyakumari versus Leh argument even more. Forget Kanyakumari and Leh. There is a difference between a school that runs in Lakshmi Nagar and a schools that runs this side of Jamna, right? Absolutely. So that's the challenge we are faced with. We need to have a global standard. So WEF does.
That's it. So that is catering to your, sorry to interrupt,
Sure.
catering to your business model. My own fundamental question is, at many levels there is a presupposition that the consumer is the student, the consumer is the parent at many levels. That's one presupposition which I have real issues with. Secondly, the concept of PISA and the global standard. Does it have relevance in the context of education and the right to it?
See, I think that's a bigger policy debate, right? That is interestingly something which is going to be opened up by the MHR, the Ministry of HRD very soon, right? What is the objective of education? And there are two ends or extremes. On one end, it is said, especially by the more advanced Western schools, that education is all about finding a child's true potential and letting that blossom. On the other end, there is another school of thought which says education is all about building a workforce for the nation. We don't care what a child wants to do, etc., etc. The nation needs so many engineers, so many doctors, and we will build that. That debate is still, the jury is still out there. What we are saying is, without disturbing that fact, right, without disturbing what the ultimate objective of education is, because that's more a social and political discussion and decision, right? All we are saying is, like there is transparency in most of the other industries, when you buy a 5 lakh ki gaadi, you know that it meets a particular EU norm, right? Doesn't matter whether you drive that gaadi in Leh or Kanyakumari. Doesn't matter if it's a 4-people family or a 1-person, or 2 people buying that car. It conveys a particular set of trust parameters before you buy it. Whether, so using your same examples, a hotel in Kerala and a hotel in Turkey are likely to be very different. They will use different materials, different restaurants, different cuisines, they hire from different places, etc. But there needs to be some kind of an indicator which helps a school convey how good or bad it is, right? Now, it might make sense to some, it might not make sense to some, right? And that's absolutely fine. The bottom line is, what I find 2 things very weird, personally. And this is I mean no disrespect to anyone in this room. I've chosen education as a field I will dedicate the next 10, 15 years, 20 years of my life to. I am not an educator by training, as I'm sure you can already tell. Education is perhaps the only industry which looks and feels the same as it did 50 years back. If you drive a car from 50 years back today, you'll see a world of a difference. If you walk into a restaurant, forget 50 years, think of, whenever each of you were 20 years old, right? Tab ke restaurant mein and aaj ke restaurant mein zameen asman ka farak hai, gaadi ka farak hai, air conditioners mein farak hai. Think of anything, think of the shoes you wear, whatever you do. A classroom from when you were 20 and today looks largely the same. Blackboard ka whiteboard ho gaya hai, non-AC ka AC ho gaya hai. There is probably digital technology which you might or might not use. But, the teacher-centric model of delivery where there are, 20, 30, 40, 50 kids sitting around and listening, that has not changed. Books as a primary mechanism to deliver content and knowledge has not changed. And that kind, it has changed in pockets. There are alternate schools, etc., but largely speaking, right? The second thing that irks me is that education still remains the only industry that does not have standards or protocols, or a large group of, and by the way, just so you know, I'm personally seriously against regulation. So I would, so somebody asked a question about CBSE, and my response is, CBSE should not be the person who's regulating it, right? But that's besides the point. Fact still remains is, you look at any industry that has developed in India over the last 20 years, look at IT, look at automotive.
Like you said, you like to see about 100 schools, study there. There are 2 issues come up. One is, what range are you looking at? Because when you look at the infrastructure, then there is just this excellent model that you showed. There are people spending 10,000 per child, there are people spending $77 per child, and within India and this particular area which you are trying to choose, there will be this variation. People who have tried accreditations, they're like C4 has done a survey, and all other issues. How are you going to monitor it? And what range are you going to pick up?
That's a beautiful question.
And one more thing I'd like to add, just yesterday only I heard, about 17,000 schools have closed in Rajasthan, government schools, another about 3,000 elsewhere. So when you're looking at this different levels, how do you pick and choose? And what will you study?
That's a beautiful question. So we have 8 parameters that we have defined purely to select a sample, right? Private school, public school, boys, girls, co-ed, boarding, non-boarding, so type of city-wise, so Sec A, Sec B, Sec C. So what we have done is we have split these 100 into these categories just so we kind of have a representative sample. Now there's obviously always a sampling error. When you pick a sample, it's never going to be as accurate or as robust as the whole population. But what we'd like to do is to get an indicative answer and say, is type ke itne schools chahiye, is type ke itne schools chahiye. So what happens then is, let's say a girls' school in Riva is getting rated at the same time as an IB school in Gurgaon or whatever, right? So therefore, we are able to see the differences and nuances. Any standard by its very nature and definition cannot not be inclusive, right? So we can't say that a standard applies to only a part of the industry, that, hey, we have a standard which we would like only urban schools to adopt or only international schools to adopt. So that is where we are working very actively, even with the government, and Rajasthan is a good example, in picking schools from there that we can choose, because their set of challenges would be drastically different from your set of challenges. Sure.
Actually, why accreditation fails in India mostly is because we are looking at the global standards.
Yeah,
we have to look at the local as well as the global aspects, because you know, education and its relevance in cultural settings are very important. So we have to, if any accreditation agency has to succeed, it has to look at both the local as well as the global standards. And then the accreditation can also be in those two areas, like the local as well as the global. The learning also, because if we teach a student in Ladakh about you know, how aircrafts are made, or you know, those details, if the student wants to go into that field, well and good, we provide that kind of education too. But we also have to provide the student that kind of education which would come handy in the student's cultural settings. That is very important.
In fact, there's a very interesting study which you guys should all refer to, which is being led by Mr. Mukul Kanitkar, who exactly has the same view, which is to say, now I might or might not agree personally, and that's besides the point, but he's saying you have a K-12 education system which is preparing 100 kids, so 2 of them can get into engineering, 2 of them can get into medicine, 1 of them can become a chartered accountant, but then what happens to the other 95? And that's a very valid question, and which is why, sorry, I was answering that question before. Just let me, yeah, can I just complete my thought? Yeah. So which is why I was saying, so in our model, as in most other models, an ISO or whatever, there is a global standardization. So if I say that here is a 4-star IB school in Dhaka versus a 4-star IB school in London, let's say, they've got to be comparable. We can't change the scale in itself. But you're right, we have to customize it. So for an example, of the 270 parameters that we have, 56 are customized to each country that we get into. And about 30 of those are customized to each board that you might have. So I think, like I said, it's a very tough, exactly as you said, ma'am, there is a very tough challenge into appealing to a very local audience and then losing out the global standardization, or on the other hand, being irrelevant locally by saying कि boss बाकी countries में ये होता है तो India में भी हम same चीज करेंगे. And
we need to question whether you know, one section of society is actually doing better than the other.
That's right. Yeah.
You know, we need to question the standards, that whether the standards in UK are applicable here or not, because there are so many other variations that we need to look at. I mean, if a family is perfectly happy in Ladakh, I mean, why should they go in for an accreditation process which is going to bring in, you know, a lot of mental tension and stress which they don't require in their lives? You know, so it's a much larger.
Absolutely. So I'll give you numbers which will be comfortable with you. A child who's born to educated parents speaks 30 lakh words more than a child born to first generation parents who don't talk at home. Which is to that extent the disparity is. And that's the same point the gentleman talked about closing of schools, 70,000 of them. It's happening at the rate of 5,000 per year in Kerala, wherein children are migrating from state board schools to private schools. The number of children are coming down. So in this whole context, the global part, do we really require the global concept, the global standards? And somehow standardization or globalization seems to be the answer to everything the education issue of these 1.4 million schools come up with. So that's our, we respect your model, that's the fundamental disagreement we have.
Yeah, and I would love to, it is not a disagreement because I do agree with you. Right. So, but two quick responses, right? A, what the diversity aspect you talked of, and that was there in one of my earlier slides, it is a fact that any industry in India needs to deal with significant more amount of diversity among, in your case, among parents and students as the Western equivalents. And I think that is the challenge that we speak about.
Western equivalents? Are the challenges the same, sir, even broadly?
No.
No. So that's why I'm saying.
I'm saying yes, I agree.
Yeah.
Right. So that's one. Secondly, the larger issues you talk about, migration from public schools to private schools, closures and all of that, that's a question for Madam Smriti Irani to answer, right? Now, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, I'm not her, right? Our organization's mandate is limited to a very, very simple, in the context of this audience, right? Very, very simple submission, right? Wherever an industry evolves into becoming as important as it is, there needs to be some way of indicating quality, right? You go for a 4-day vacation to Goa, you invest in a company, you go and figure out कि अच्छा क्रिसिल ने क्या rating दिया है XYZ bond को, या Zagat ने क्या rating दिया है इस hotel को. To me, it is just, from a layman's perspective, very weird that you send a kid to school for 10 years, 12 years, and there is no mechanism to do that. Now that mechanism could be us, it could be somebody else. It could be local, it could be global. That is a larger existential debate. All we are saying is there needs to be a mechanism, and for those that see value, and which is why we're saying 100 schools. We're not saying, otherwise we would have said 14 lakh schools. Sorry, I've been...
Sorry, I know you're running out of time.
Yeah,
Let's look at this, the poverty level, they say $2. Okay. But then in the Indian context, $1 is defined like 30 rupees. So would you be talking about something like that when you say there is a global parameter, but that parameter could be evaluated in a different scale?
Correct. So that's a very interesting question. The graph that I showed you was purely dollar numbers. Within the same UNESCO report, there is another table that has purchasing power parity numbers. So I could send you the link separately, but again, it doesn't change much. From 77, it goes up to like $93, but the stock between less than 100 and 10,000 still remains. Anyway, sorry, I've been told multiple times I need to get off stage.
Would you like to know the parameters that processes the whole?
Sure. Can we just catch up offline, because you know this guy here is much bigger than me, and I'm sure he can take me on man to man. So I'm just going to thank you all, get off stage. I will be outside over the networking break, and let's catch up. And thank you all for being very patient listeners. Cheers.
Thank you, Mr. Anuraag, for enlightening us with such an inspiring session. We would like to felicitate Mr. Anuraag on the behalf of EdTechReview and ELC partner. Mr. Divya Prakash, would you do the honors, please? Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Anuraag Saxena.